He'll be
He'll
here
be
every time he goes.
So this is okay, Kyle.
Brilliant. You're laughing.
See how many are left at the end. To teach it sort of would sort of come together in a sort of lecture form at one point. Well, whenever I start this lecture, I don't know what to say, but let's sort of go into it. Let me see how these slides work. Push forward. Okay. What I want to talk about is something that has come up in looking at images in the world. When you see this line of voters on the left, or this rock on the right, I was struck by this strange, you could call it a negotiation between what one could call a sort of willfulness and willingness. That this rock on the right, my brother gave me a couple of years ago and said, well, what do you think this is? Man-made, or is it organic? And so we had a good discussion about it. It doesn't really matter what it is, but what I think it points out is that there is something going on. There is something about some desire to, there's some kind of negotiation that goes on between a desire to project forward some intent and, you could say, the kind of physical limit of something. So you can see, like in the voter line, that there is some kind of desire, one could say, to follow something or to project something, but then there's also some kind of, one could say, contingency acting on that voter line. So this is what I want to enter into a little bit as we go on and talk about, as this being sort of, you could say, symptomatic of, you could say, how the creative process works and what seeing is. Now this painting by Schinkel, The Origin of Drawing, is to me a very important image, because here you see something which is, you could say, again, a symptom, evidence of something which otherwise we're not really aware of. We live each day naturally, and it's only really in, sort of say, the educational form that we sort of pull things apart. When this painting, and by an architect, no doubt, does something which is, I think, important, which is that the painting again reveals this negotiating aspect, that the painting is two things. It's both a recording and a representation. It's a recording in so much that you can see that the sun is shining on the face and is being recorded in profile, the origin of drawing. But it's also a representation. And by that I mean that there is a certain kind of intent involved, that there is an idea about what's being projected. Now you know that if you would face the sun, all you would project would be a blob onto that rock. So there is an intent to have something appear. There is a turning of the head and holding of the head still to get the image. So you can see there's two things at play, recording and representation. This is a painting most of you probably saw because it was in London last year. But it's also being talked about that way, a kind of, you could say, a remarkable painting, because out of that blackness comes a kind of, one could say, again, these two ways of understanding something, that the painting has been discussed as a geometric progression, right? That there is a parabolic curve, that there is an intent to move towards, you could say, some kind of noumenal clarity. At the same time, the painting is also seen to be a kind of strange quest for repose, in other words, for gravity to make its mark felt. And on the right is a page out of, I think it was Turner's pedagogical exercise in the 19th century, where he had students, you could say, doing this kind of work consciously. On the upper part are exercises for the students to do, which are construction exercises for geometric figures. So out of the mind, constructing. And the bottom is a feather, so kind of into the mind recording. Now, when we see, you could say, a kind of extreme position taken in terms of seeing the world, of being in the world, we can see often as a parody, Blake's parody of Newton, or the Newtonian universe, as a kind of cut off from the senses, senselessness is, you could say, a kind of extreme example of working or seeing only through the mind. And Jenkins, the painter, his painting, trying to work, you could say, without touching the painting, without intent, kind of a mindlessness, is also something we're aware of. Not to say that there is a kind of necessarily a pejorative aspect to that, but just to see it at the extremes, we start to become aware of this vision having a kind of a division. Even in schools, and certainly we look at the Bauhaus, you can say that's almost become a 20th century archetype. There was a clear, you could say, didactic effort to meld, we could say, these two ways of seeing or being in the world, the intellect and the intuition, being melded in this center. Now, in terms of literally the design of the Bauhaus, you can see that this diagram was built as the auditorium, the dining hall, with the stage in the center. Now, the stage is, as you know, in the Bauhaus was critical. It was the place of play, but play in the most serious way. And just to show you this stage, because in a way, this is what I want to get to in the lecture. This realization that there is some kind of split image or split way of understanding the world, and that only through, you could call it play, as some philosophers have called it, or you could call it the third eye, or the imagination. Only through this other medium can we start to make sense of those two visions. Now, the Greeks had an argument, a long-standing one, about the origin of the circle. And some would argue, as it goes, that the circle was something that was a divine figure. It sprang from our minds outward into the world. And others would argue that, no, that wasn't true at all, that the circle was something that was, so I say, roughly approximated when you see a rock rolling down a hill or a log rolling, that this became the kind of slow sort of discovery of the circle from the world itself. Now, these two words, eidos and enteleki, are, in a way, the words I'm using to sort of hold these two, one could say, these two sides of the argument, but it's not so much an argument. It's, I think, more kind of a vision of the world that we carry with us. And I think this is something we all share. Eidos meaning the idea or the image. Enteleki meaning literally the actualization of the form-giving force. Now, those are verbal descriptions, and I'll go through a kind of a left-right sort of set of slides to try to get at why these sort of this seam has opened up, and why I think the imagination is located actually in between eidos and enteleki, between these two ways of seeing things, that these two visions are, in a way, antinomical. They can't be reasoned into each other. There's no sense between them, and the imagination is what allows a kind of a jump between the two visions back to the sort of seamlessness. See, when we're not thinking or when we're not doing anything, we don't have a problem. It's only when we start to work on a project, any kind of creative act, that we run into a problem. If we didn't, we wouldn't be here. You wouldn't have the AA. You wouldn't have any school. So there's something going on. Now, here's some examples of why I think there's a drift apart of these two visions, or into these two visions. Both of these are navigational charts from the Marshall Islanders. And these charts are very difficult to read. And what's happened is that for didactic reasons, you can say, here you have a chart that is much simpler. And this chart is used to teach. And it's you could say an example of this chart that is trying to make the idea clear. Now, as the idea becomes clear, the actuality, the actual marks on the chart that correspond to marks in the world start to disappear. And you get really just the idea. And this chart, in all its complexity, is an attempt, you could say, to record or to hold on to the facts of of the various islands that the Marshall Islanders navigate through. And those arcs are actually wave fronts, a strange phenomena that happens when waves hit an island. They reflect off for vast distances, and like drops of water into a puddle, when they overlap, they make a little wave front. Could be hundreds of miles away from an island. And so they navigate from wavefront to wavefront. Now I want to go back for a second to this idea of eidos and entelechy, because I sort of was very brief. But I guess what I want to say about these two views, maybe just expand on them a little bit, is that, well, Plato used the word eidos, and of course Plato, we understand the Platonic view. But Plato was not interested in the stuff of the world, or his, the vision that he wrote about, spoke about, was one which saw the world as basically as a veil, as something that needed to be moved aside in order to get to the idea. Now, Aristotle spoke differently, and he talked about the world as the stuff that needed to be actualized, and hence the word entelechy, right? That the mission, you could say, of seeing was to, so we say, not brush aside the world to get to the image, but to force the world to give up itself, that everything was there in front of us, and we just needed to act on it in order to see it. And here's another example, you could say, of eidos and entelechy. Again, the pulling apart. Here, the idea of the New York water tower as being where the actualization of the form-giving forces can be seen. So you see the bands on the water tower getting narrow, closer and closer together as the weight of the water, increases towards the bottom. The bands have to then become, of course, more closely spaced, and you have this actualization of the forces. And opposed to this, these other vessels here, these are Egyptian burial vessels, where the vessel itself was not even, it was not even important for the vessel to function. So you see the vessels are not even carved out. They're just the form, the image of the vessel was necessary to travel into the afterlife, not the actual vessel itself. The idea of looking at the universe, you could say, is the ultimate question of seeing, because we can never get out there, so we're always left, you say, to wonder about it through our eyes. And of course now more instruments. But historically, we've looked at the universe, we've looked at the stars, and made sense out of it. And we can see in star maps the idea of the making sense. You can see this one here where you could say the idea of the constellations is competing with the stars themselves. You can see the different signs being imprinted on the map as much as the stars. And Galileo was so important because he was the first to brush away the idea and get back to, you could say, pure recording, trying to look as if for the first time. Now these two are just sort of, you could say, a kind of a progression of that idea. This is supposedly, now this is probably 10 years old, so it's been eclipsed. This was a document with the most information on it, visual information. There's something like, 5 million stars located. And this is some kind of computer printout of the stars. Stars are black in this case. And there you have an example of sort of the extreme of pure recording. And in this example here, again, you have the constellations, but in this case, the constellations have now, in a way, overwhelmed the stars, so we see almost the pure idea of the constellations. It's the same thing that's being looked at. Two different visions. Or memory. We all know that we speak about first impressions, or forgetting. Memory is something where you can see the memory as an idea of recording. Right here, the snow can record that passing moment, but then, of course, the snow is insubstantial and disappears. So you can see again the kind of conflict between eidos and entelechy is that you can't have it both ways. You can't have the sensitivity of the record or you can't have you could say the timelessness of the record. You can have one or the other. And this here is apparently the oldest architectural plan in existence. And the only reason that it actually exists is it was redrawn from the clay tablet onto this stone. So it moved away from its original actuality and moved closer to being, you could say, just the idea of that plan as it left the material behind. But in that case, it became permanent. It's ironic, of course, because the building is gone. Or this example of a life. Here, these are craftsmen's hammers. They all started out the same way. And over a lifetime, they became distorted and misshapen. And you can see that every hammer is just a little bit different because of the habits of the craftsmen as they worked. So here's, you could say, kind of a recording of a lifetime, as opposed to this, which you could say is the idea being held, but not the record. This is a small little entombment of a snake. And that apparently the skeleton of the snake is inside. But now what we see is the image of the snake, not the actuality of it. So we can go right to architecture. We don't have to be shy to move around, because I think this is exactly what Mies was doing in Chicago. When he came over, the first corner that he built with the I-beam was this one, where you could see the actuality of the I-beam being deployed. That the I-beam is a record of the construction of that corner. There's nothing hidden there. But watch him shift, and very much like the snake on top of its little sarcophagus, you see that towards the kind of eidetic notion, the I-beam becomes emblematic on top of or outside of the column enclosure, and the oriented I-beam is buried within, because he wanted to, of course, overcome the problem of directionality. He wanted no direction. This last sort of set, the pulling apart of these forces that we can call the forces of civilization and culture. I don't know how well that term translates here in England, but let me try to speak about it a little bit. But Korb talked about the standard as being kind of a getting closer, or actually being an ideal, a getting closer to the actuality of things. So you can imagine an airplane wing as being something that he would celebrate, because it was the actualization of the forces at play, whether they were wind forces or engineering forces or even economic forces, even building materials. We use the 2x4 in the States. It can't be smaller. It would be too weak. It can't be bigger, because it would be too expensive. And that's an example of a piece that's called a standard. It is you could say, the actuality of all the forces at play. Now that's very different than this side, which is these are just some pots. I think it's from Viollet-le-Doux's book, but that's not important. The only point being that the idea of the type is the idea that away from the forces, something else can emerge. You could say the production of meaning can be undertaken. So there is some kind of conflict in these two visions that you could say is something to do with civilization, culture, the production of meaning, the production of, or the uncovery of truth as being, in a way, antinomical to each other. In this case, it's just that you can change the handles. It doesn't matter, right? The handles are free from the forces at play. It still functions, roughly, right? Which is the way we would understand what is typical. It looks like stars, but it's not. It's just a blank slide. I know, you start seeing stars everywhere now. Just a few examples now of this kind of leaping over, like you could say, looking for evidence of the imagination, like leaping over, one could say, these kinds of differences, or this kind of, this antinomical condition. Galileo, again, made a kind of I would say, the imaginative leap. As you probably know, he was a pretty good artist as well as a good scientist. And these are his first sketches from observing the moon. Now he, as well as everyone else, was curious about this strange phenomena on the moon, which was when the moon is very new, you can see the whole moon, and there's a strange kind of glow. And everybody was always wondering what that strange glow was. Now, it was Galileo who made the leap and realized that the glow was the light coming from the Earth back onto the moon. And that leap is made, I would say it wasn't made empirically. It was partially empirical through recording. It was also through understanding the whole, you could say, the idea of light and reflection. Because in Italy, of course, he was well aware of the kind of facility, the aspects of chiaroscuro. So you see here the young baby's head reflecting up underneath the Madonna's chin, right? That to make that leap between seeing this in the moon and understanding it through, you could say, the principle, the idea of chiaroscuro was a kind of a leap. Now, I've been talking about seeing, and I just want to just show these two because, in a way, it shows also, we know this so well. You know, you realize something, you know, and that you realize also that blindness is caused by sometimes a kind of a knowledge that isn't necessarily enlightening. It might be knowledge that's blinding. Thomas Harriot had the same telescope as Galileo, and when the moon was in this phase, because he dated his drawings, he drew this, which was very close to the commonly, as you could say, the iconic image of the moon that was known in painting historically. And it has nothing to do with the actuality of the moon. But when Galileo published his drawings of the moon, a year later, Harriot with the same telescope was observing the moon this way. So it's a strange, you could say, insight that's going on. And so you can see that seeing is more than simply, you could say, a physical act. It's also a mental act. Dirar, another example, I think, of making this bridge or leap between these two visions. Dirar was a very careful observer of the eyes when he painted. And there was a kind of threshold in his life when he made a discovery, and this is in a way a kind of a speculation by others, but it seems to be reasonable, because at a certain point his eyes moved from this kind of study of reflection to something much more concretely, one could say, like that, where you see a kind of a cross. Now, what's remarkable about that is because, first of all, the religious content of the paintings and the whole idea of what the eye is, you know, as a window to the soul. At the same time, you see the window being reflected in the eye, and that window has a mullion, but it's more than a mullion, it's also a cross. So you see there a kind of a fusing of, you could say, actuality and, you know, you could say, enteleki and eidos. Right then and there, there's a moment, kind of a precious moment, where both the symbol and the actuality are the same thing. And from then on, this is why the speculation sort of seems to carry some weight. From then on, there was always a mullion or a cross in all his religious paintings. And everyone else picked this up too. And so you start to see these kind of mullion crosses in all these religious paintings. And what's quite amusing about them, you see here another mullion cross, is that this painting, for example, these are two close-ups of one painting, and I forget who did the painting, forgive me. This is an outdoor scene. So already I would say, there's a kind of a degradation of that moment, perhaps a necessary one, where the cross is no longer a kind of a fused understanding of, you could say, the actuality and the idea, but it has now become, you could say, an icon, or you could say a linguistic device. And of course, you see the degradation of these moments further and further when you open up the Sunday cartoon and you see the shiny ball has a mullion painted on it, right? It's become a kind of a graphic symbol. Now I just want to show a few examples to get us back looking at architects. I think just some examples of where you see, I think, these two visions sort of coming back together in different ways. Now Leverance's, and this is probably from a book that was published here, Leverance's, I think, beautiful windows are, I think for myself, examples of trying to get both visions sort of existent. The idea, you could say, of transparency, pure transparency, immaterialness is fused with the idea of the materiality, which of course glass has that ambiguous character and it's able to carry both. Or his lights, which I always loved so much because I thought that these lights were the perfect inverse of plants, that these lights were tropic, but dark loving, that in my mind I could imagine him, wanting to bend these light fixtures towards the darkest spots. And so there's a kind of recording, you could say, of the darkness, but also the idea of plants, of tropism. I think I'll just go on and just end, because I think, and this is a well-known chapel, the Saarinen Chapel at MIT, but I kind of end here because, well, just to recover the original starting point, which was the question about the circle. Is it from the mind or is it found in the world? And I think the MIT chapel, for myself, has always been this kind of very beautiful, you could say, blending or binding of these two circles, the pure circle of the mind and then the circle that's slowly found, you could say, through the world as phenomena. Now, I'm going to just go through, I'll show you a few projects. And in a way, these projects are, well, I hope that what I just talked about has some kind of relevance to these projects. So, this is something that started 10 years ago. This is one of the last things I did in graduate school. And Michael, you probably remember this. You saw some of this. But this has stayed with me till now because, in a way, this was my sort of, this is an important discovery. Here I was working with lead and copper, and I was sort of making objects, but it was finally when I crushed the lead and copper that I realized I had sort of found something that took me a little bit beyond, you could say, the object-making aspect, which was that the copper and the lead didn't give up their materiality, didn't give up their relation with each other until they were crushed. And then the copper started to act as a kind of a structure. The lead started to flow and become a kind of a body. And there was something fused about the two, and there was other pieces done. But this, in a way, led to a project which is still going on. All my projects seem to never end. And it's because I'm very, very slow, I think. I had this idea of building a chair like a fossil, very, very densely, that if I was wondering, a kind of a rhetorical question, could one make a chair out of a solid piece with no gaps, nothing, just a solid piece, could that be transformed to a chair? And later on, as the chair developed out of that, you can see that there was both an attempt to hold on to this idea of that solid and then to let the chair act, I guess you could say, to give the chair, you'd say, a certain kind of life so that certain elements of the chair could give way, right, to the body, etc. So it's a folding chair, and you can see here it's in its unfolded, and there it's in its folded position. And it's changed somewhat. It no longer cuts itself up, as you see there. And there's some slides of it we'll see in a second. And there you see it's the kind of strange unfolding that has to happen because it has to unfold from itself. This is the state of it now. It's in a way, I'd say it's 90% complete. It's just something that I have to finish. But you can see that the pieces are all in various degrees of, you could say, negotiation between this idea of the solid and the, so to say, trying to get closer to the actuality of seating. the very faint slides. And you can see that the location of the setting up of the geometry, because the chair acts like a four-bar linkage. If you know about four-bar linkages, they're the kind of the early computers. Cash registers were made out of them. But with a four-bar linkage, with just four linked pieces, you can get very, very complex motions. So anytime you have four hinge points, you get sort of a very complex set of motions that you have to constantly adjust the lengths to get the exact right motion. So at the same time that this is going on, there's also the idea of reinforcement. And you can see that certain hardware starts to ride the bodily, so we say, curvatures. Other hardware has to ride this purely mathematical problem of the four-bar linkage. This is a house that, we can focus the one on the left. This was a house that was started in 1989, and we're about 3 years from getting finished. So, but it's a little bit further along than the one on the right, you can see. But this house, I want to go through this quickly because, well, let's see. We are okay with time. Okay. This house was a very simple project. The owner is a tradesman, a plasterer. And he came to me and said, well, I have a lot, and there's rules on the lot. You're only allowed to build this wide by that long, by that high, because it's a corner lot, and there's no other, there is no extra room. So that was the plot, and the plot couldn't be moved anywhere. It couldn't be changed. You couldn't build over it, except for 4 feet on one side. You could overhang with non-enclosed structures. So it was strange. It seemed like a very miserable problem, but also was my first real commission for a freestanding building. And so it didn't seem very inspiring to be told all these rules. At the same time, the client was also insistent that, the house has this, and then he also had 2 very large automobiles which he would like to store inside. And this tiny little plot looked more and more miserable. But what we ended up doing was sort of making a game out of it, you could say, and using the plot as a kind of a envelope, which we just filled up completely. And we built to the extent that you could. We just made it 30 feet high, because that's how high you're allowed to make it, 24 feet by 36 feet, with the 4-foot overhang. We just took the lawyer's brief, and that became, in a way, the beginning point of the house, and then started to allow the house to start to operate freely within that envelope. And so you can see even the plan was, in a way, following the same idea. So this became a very simple strategy, a very simple sort of, you could say, attempt to bring, you could say, life into this place. So the house was very small, it is very small, and it's a 3-story house. And the idea recurs over and over again, the idea of trying to make exaggerated, too large a space, allowing some space to be, we could say, centrifugal, some spaces to be centripetal. So some spaces become very blown up, and other spaces then become very compressed and squeezed down. And so we started to treat that as a strategy for everything, for the plan, and you'll see for the elevations as well. And here you see a model of it, and you can see in the elevations the same thing, that the windows started to get either too large or too small. The windows were allowed to go up to the ceiling and into a wall. There's no, of the large windows, they're all fixed. They're all sort of, you could say, again, this kind of expanding field, which is then interrupted or locked or stopped by either hitting the wall or hitting a wall and the ceiling until it can't go further. And then the smaller windows become very compressed, and they become deeper and free-floating. So just at the level of things like details, that also starts to recur. So you can see that in terms of details, this is a typical wood construction house. There was no extra budget, and the builder was someone who doesn't read drawings, so it had to be pretty straightforward. So, but there were certain things that we were able to do, and we're doing more and more of that. It's like one example here, burying the window in the wall, so the window even goes past the wall, and so a detail sort of emerges of the glass being almost flush to the wall, that the frame is sunken away. And the same with the ceiling. And this is just a model photograph. You can see the window in a typical situation having sort of been trapped in the ceiling and in the wall. And here we are just under construction, and this is a very large model which was used by the builder to sort of figure things out, because it became quite dense, the things. You can see he's looking down this spot right here, trying to figure out how to build it, because it became the sort of densest space in the house. There's no doors. This is behind the master bedroom. Things like a shower, dressing table, a closet, storage space is all condensed behind the bedroom, but it's a real warren, as you can see. A bit like a ship. And you can see now the house has turned color, and that was an idea that was important, which was that the plasterer he's going to do the plastering himself, and a lot of the details demand that he does the plastering himself, because there'll be a lot of raking light in the house and a lot of testing of his accuracy. And the outside is allowed to change, to give itself over to the kind of coloration conditions around the site. And the windows are also not just, there was another play going on, which I'll just note, which was to do with creating blind spots on the site. So the windows, as much as about offering vision, are also about cutting off vision or creating blind spots, because when the windows go into the corners, they make possible your inability to see certain things, which was important in this neighborhood. We wanted to be discreet and give a certain kind of openness, yet maintain the privacy. You can see that in terms of this, transforming this lawyerly envelope into, you could say, a kind of a piece of geology that would be, you could say, something that would read the house. We also extended that idea into the way we brought water down. You see the water is brought down in a cut in the side of the house. It happens on both sides. There's a copper line cut that lets the water run down. That's all that's necessary. One doesn't need to enclose it. And then underneath, as you see, this is a rear entrance to the house. There's a copper-clad area, which is an area that will be used for an outdoor shower, which is a typical thing one has there, because this is by the ocean in Rhode Island. There you see the cut. And there you just see it a little bit more in its context. Just this last image, which was not so, it was only partially anticipated. The interest in this corner was to just to build the corner through, so there would be some kind of transparency, a kind of one could say, how I say, red transparency, as well as a literal transparency. But a kind of one of the consequences, which was important, I think, as a kind of lesson, was you can see there that there's another kind of transparency. You see actually the reflection of the wind of this side into that side generates a kind of a third transparency, where the reflection just sort of lines up and sort of re-emphasizes the fact that those mullions are moving into the house. But those aren't the mullions you're seeing. It's just a reflection of the mullions on the right side. Shifting to another project, which is, I think, related more specifically to the Sunworks. This project, called Wanderer House, was an attempt to sort of get at a distilled idea of habitation, or the act of inhabitation. And I think there's a couple images which were important as a sort of initiating the thoughts, or initiating, one could say, the questions. And this the Milanese Pietà, I don't know if you know it well, but one remarkable aspect of it is this play of the figures against each other, and how the figures seem to alternate depending on your point of view between the mother holding up the son or the son holding up the mother. That gravity is in a way something that seems both an idea and both actual. That there is some kind of, you could say, spirit in this sculpture that addresses, that is, I would say, comes to us through a question of gravity. The other, I guess, beginning point that I was looking for, you can say, was kind of something archetypal about inhabitation. In a way, two archetypes have always sort of been strong for me. And one is, you could say, the cave, or the idea that the solid could have something excavated that you could dwell in. You know, and I think we carry this archetype of the cave around. And certainly when you look at some of these castle plans, the cave is still there. The other archetype of inhabitation being you could say the nomad, which is inhabitation being a form of a kind of a freedom of movement. And those archetypes, I think, are, again, antinomical. They don't reason. One does not reason the other. They just exist. We understand them. So this project became about allowing two things to come together and find their consequences. Again, it's less of much, I was not so much interested in this as a formal exercise, but I was more interested in finding, in other words, following the consequences of things to kind of find the animus that could sort of bring this, sort of say, life term inhabitation out. So this drawing is pretty obscure, but what I started to do was just play with volumes and allow the idea of an inner volume, or one volume, to exist in one world and another volume to exist in another world. Now the two worlds are, one could say, very simply, in a way, defined. One is that the volume that's on the inside, you see on the right, the volume that's the space, is not oriented towards what we would call our physical world. Our physical world is inescapably about gravity, about the horizon. And so the inner world that I started to play with was just one that was free. And I spent a long time looking for this point of freedom, that one could never say that it had any orientation specifically. One can argue that it's a chicken and egg argument, that the inner volume is defined by the outer volume, or one could go the other way around. But the inner volume just isn't true to gravity, it isn't true to the horizon. It drifts, one could say, freely. And it's seen as a kind of a projection through this outer volume, and you could say a kind of a life-giving projection, and that the projection has consequences, one could say, or the outer volume splitting has consequences. As you see, the project then becomes a kind of a quest after, you could say, a kind of a, how to say, dialogue or coming together of these two different worlds. And so the outer volume, this is quite abstract, and I'll show some images of the models. The outer world, as a way of becoming conscious, starts to, the outer volume is split, and one can reason that it's split by the inner volume. One could also reason that it exists first and the inner volume is a result. But that's not the point. The point was not to have a kind of inevitable beginning, and I think that makes sense when we think about our own beginnings. But the outer volume proceeds by a certain kind of logic. It understands center and starts to make probes towards the inner volume. These are different plans, by the way, different levels. They're just cuts at a lower level, further up again. And you can see that there is some kind of change as you go through the levels. But it's simply one volume, and it's going through another volume. And I'm not giving a shape to one to say it means this. They're both the same shape. They're both off of the square as a kind of disinterested, you could say, figure. So from the center of the outer volume, there's a growth, you could say, a probe to measure towards the inner volume. And the inner volume does the same thing. From its center, it has probes that grow outwards. And so when the probes meet and cross, they form a disjunction. And those crossings start to become places where light enters. Right? And so I'm looking for what inhabitation is. A kind of one could say, a search for those passages that allow movement, the passages that bring light in. And so this is a model of it. You can see that there's the splitting of the outer piece, the fragmenting of the outer piece, which is then, in a way, unified by this volume that's hidden inside, passing through it. And you can see that these gaps are simply the intersections of these probes, one growing out, one growing in, that have passed through each other and start to become the light sources. There's one last aspect, which is say, in terms of inhabitation, which is the movement within. And you can see that this strange figure here, this stair, rises up, and it seems to have a kind of independent movement. It doesn't seem to correspond to either the geometry here or the geometry in the inside. But what it really is simply a kind of crawling up. Oh, we'll get to it in a second. These are just some more views. You can see the split volumes, and you see the inner volume that binds them, and the consequence of just these fins. And the outer fins, the physical fins, are the ones that carry the weight, the structure, and they become thicker. And the inner fins are thinner, and they just are partitions. The stair that goes up simply follows the volume up. But the stair is sometimes slung on the outside, depending on the face that's being followed up the inner volume, sometimes on the outside, sometimes on the inside. The stair then simply follows, you could say, some kind of consistency, but then because of the volume, the inner volume, the stair starts to cut back and forth. And that became a kind of way of saying, or a realization about inhabitation, right? That by moving through this structure, you were able to be in both worlds, the physical and then the internal one. You could say the one that has no connection to the physical. Right? But by your movement, you bonded the two together. And there, I'm just sort of taking this model apart so we can see inside. There you see the stair. Here you're on the outside, going around the corner, and the stair simply just follows the kind of its internal logic. And then here the stair cuts through, because it's going on a different slope, is on the inside. And there are the fins. And you see these gaps, again, for light that cut through. And you see this, now this is, you could say, simply a projection through a volume, and it is. And one of the uncanny things that started to happen was that kind of relativism. This is exactly the same face of the model that we're looking at. But just from, this is, you could say, true to gravity in the horizon, the outer physical part. And this is true to the inner part. And that, in a way, became sort of an interest to see how those two worlds still only, they still can be difficult to fuse in the mind. You see that here, this is a view that's a plan view from the top, looking straight down, and this projection is a plan view of the inner volume. It's simply our wanting to see it one way or the other that gives us a certain kind of bias or point of view. But they're both, you could say, pure plans. And you see that the figure, the perfect square, appears only in plan, and when it's cut, as in this case, when we look at it as a physical thing, we see a distorted figure, and it starts to disappear. In the last slide, which is just as you saw the model, there's an indentation in the ground. And for myself, this was maybe the best moment in the project. which was that here the two came together because you could say as the inner volume exited the outer volume, they sort of fused, or you say they became confused, and so we're left with neither one nor the other, but a kind of a figure that is, you could say, a third figure, something that's the two fused again. So now this is the project, this last project that I'm going to show you. I've been talking all for the last half hour, 45 minutes about seeing, and I guess that sort of holds my interest, or I could say defines my interest to a great deal. This project, I think, was much more specifically about seeing. I became interested in the sun, just in a kind of casual way. I thought, well, what is the sun? Very simple questions, everyday kind of questions, like what is the form of the sun as it moves through the sky? And much to my surprise, it wasn't at all what I thought it would be. And so this is now the project that sort of follows that kind of discovery. But the slide on the left here, just to make a point before I start, is a slide of, it's the first time we've been able to photograph an electron. So that little blue dot up there is an electron photographed. It's a marvelous achievement. In a way, it's stunning to think, well, this is what we can do today. It also makes us feel, in a way, helpless, like what's there to pursue? Why bother trying to see things if we can, with technology, see so much? And I guess as we see more, we also see less, because there are certain tribes in New Guinea, Claude Lévi-Strauss wrote about, or mariners in the 16th century that navigated by following Venus during the day. Now, no one here has seen Venus during the day. It's not that you can't, it's that you can't be bothered, or there's no need to. But if you try, you won't be able to see Venus during the day. It takes an enormous amount of training and belief to see Venus. So, as we see more, we see less. We don't have the need to, but we don't believe. There's something about believing that, you could say, impels vision. So, I guess this project is trying to get to see if there's more to see in the sun. So, what I did first is I made these are simple turned pieces, which are exactly the form the sun makes, the form, you could say, that's described by the sun's movement in the sky at various times of the year. For example, if you were to locate yourself in the center of these cones, either conic dish or cone segment, and to follow the sun, it's a building sort of solidifying everything below what you're tracking when you're following the sun. The surprise was that, and this is counterintuitive, was that normally you think, okay, well, the sun is sort of drifting in the sky generally, and the surprise was to realize that the sun actually makes a concave motion, that it actually makes a motion like this in the sky. And it was hard for me to believe, but it is so. It's like looking at, you could say, if we were in a cylinder, looking up at the ceiling, that the sun makes that kind of motion in June. And it makes a more, so to say, the believable motion like that in December. And it makes a perfectly straight plane in September 21st and March 21st. Now, that's nothing earth-shaking, but I thought it was interesting to start to see about trying to record that or trying to hold that light. And so the first thought was to think of holding the light to a certain point and following the consequences of that. And what happened was that, in a way, architecture appeared right there through the thickness of material. Because the moment thickness appeared, all sorts of interesting possibilities sort of came along with that. One was that once you allow light to enter through a thickness, you can adjust the dimension of things to hold light for a certain amount of time. And so these first these are just diagrams. This diagram here is just an indication of how, if you want to hold light for, let's say, a set amount of time, and allowing the light to fall through the window at different times of year or day, you generate all sorts of different dimension of openings, even though they would be, so I say, set to hold the light for 5 minutes, let's say, and to have it fall at the center. So that became an interest that sort of evolved into this idea of a clock and a calendar. And so because if it was reasoned that if you could hold the light for a certain amount of time and you can hold it at a certain amount of time, well, then you're playing, you're making a timepiece. So this was the very first sort of thought. Now, because the sun moves differently in the sky, it moves very rapidly during the course of the day, but during the course of the year, in terms of its vertical change, it's much more slow. So we found that this kind of semi-digital approach, it's kind of strange, right, to kind of let the light mark things, was restricted. That you couldn't, for example, if you wanted to have the light marked every 5 minutes, you'd basically eat up the wall. So there became some kind of tension between wanting to see and wanting to also preserve structure. That's why it became a kind of an architectural problem. And so you can see that in the horizontal band that there are openings here for every hour, and that in the vertical that there are the openings can only hold, so to say, the light each month. Otherwise, you would end up eating up the material. So these are all ideas at this point. So what we did is we sort of went through the whole exercise of setting up a box, a figure, and these are the drawings for the figure, and starting to see how that figure worked. Now, here is just the basic drawings, and you can see that these arcs have some kind of dotted line. Now, the dotted line, all that is because when we started to work with the sun, we were also in a way biased. We said, well, it must be uniform, or it must be kind of general, the idea that we're working with. And after a while, we realized, and with the help of very good data, that it's far more interesting to be very specific with the sunlight. And so, because the more specific you get, the closer you get to the actuality of it, the more certain phenomena start to appear. And this dotted line is the wobble that the Earth undergoes because of Kepler's law, the fact that as we orbit around the sun, sometimes we're closer to the sun, and we have to therefore move faster from day to day. And so, well, it translates to the fact that when you say the sun at 12 noon, doesn't mean the sun is going to be overhead at 12 noon. And we have a certain kind of presumption that when someone says the sun at 12 noon, it means that the sun is at its highest point, but it's not true. The sun can be drifting anywhere back and forth. So this is clock noon. You can see that the drift of the sun back and forth on this wall. Now, these are openings for clock time, and all allowing the sun to fall through this wall to a spot in the center of the floor behind that wall. So you can see that the wobble, once you get accurate, starts to appear. So other debris almost starts to appear. So this is this first little box we made, and this is just a diagram in reference to those marks that you saw on the walls in the slide just before. Those funny draping and curving marks are really quite interesting in terms of their relationship to these conic pieces, is that you realize that all those marks are sections through the cones that the sun makes in the sky every day. And there you see that here's a cone for June 21st, and this is just showing the strange draping that happens. Is that when you cut a cone this way on that June 21st, when you cut a cone, this is the cone of June 21st, with the orthogonal box, you'll generate that shape. So it's purely a geometric consequence, those drapings, and it's a projection situation. So here's the inside of the box, and for us, I mean, in a way, we were kind of dumb not to realize this much earlier. That, of course, the light, will fall through at its appointed hour onto its appointed spot, but it'll also fall through all sorts of other times to other places. And so we realized that this wasn't really much of a clock or calendar, but it was interesting enough. I mean, the light here would drift around through lots of openings, and only the light that touched a certain spot would be the light that belonged to a certain hour or a certain time of year and acting as a clock. But this became more interesting when we started to use it as a recording device. And you see here what these are records. They're sepia prints. Every morning, 4 layers of sepia paper were laid into the bottom of this box. And the box was put out on a balcony for the whole day and then brought in. This went on for a year and a half. And the first 3 layers of sepia paper would be burnt through, and they would be overexposed. And then the 4th layer would be like this. And so we discovered slowly that this box maybe wasn't such a good calendar, but what it gave us was something really interesting, which was allowed us to see the motion of the world, or of the apparent motion of the sun around us, but of the world around the sun. And so you can see here the fact that we live on a sphere starts to appear. This is close to March 21st or September 21st. I forget which one, because they cross over. They're identical at that point. When I described the motion of the sun that day, or the apparent motion, where I described a plane, and so you see these streaks becoming very straight. This is close to December 21st, and you see the curvature in the streaks. This is something we didn't expect. So what we did is, after a year and a half, is get this record together. And sometimes, of course, on cloudy days, there was no record, and there's lots of cloudy days. So there's a film that I brought, and what we've done with the film is use each of these days as a frame. So what we can do now is look at the film just before we start looking at it. We look at the film, and we'll immediately start to see this motion, and it's really what it is the animation of these frames. So be able to see, I think, sort of 2 motions, because what I did with the film is I looped it so that you can see a kind of repeat, so you can get a sense of the motion. And there's one version that's at 1 speed, and then there's another version that's looped about 8 times. That's very, very quick. So you'll see about 12 years passing. So why don't we look at the film now? If I can, should I just turn these off? All the way. And at 24 frames too. Okay. Here we're going into summer. And this idea of solstice, meaning stopped sun, you can start to see the pausing of the sun that the ancients always knew about, but in a way we don't see anymore. See, around December 21st and June 21st, the sun seems to pause in the sky because of our motion around, spherical motion. Here we're coming up to June 21st. Here we're coming through to September 21st, and then bending over into December 21st. So you can see the Earth revealing itself. We'll go through one more time. can see when we accelerate the motion, you start to see different things. So that's that version. Now there's a very fast motion version. Well, we got a commission and a grant, a very small commission, or small grant. And we're offered a site in the public park, the main public park in Providence, to build some version of this little box. The little box we had was only this big. It was only about a foot tall. And so we decided we'd build as big as we could. That was our ambition. And so we decided to try to make this work as a calendar and a clock. And so some things had to happen. So looking at this thing again, we realized quite quickly that it was quite a simple thing we had to do to make it really be effective as a calendar and clock. We had been allowing the light to fall into the center, but then realizing that all sorts of light falls in. And we didn't like the idea of a public piece being, in a way, kind of internalized. And we wanted to make it, sort of say, extroverted. And so we realized that without changing any geometry, just by flipping this whole thing upside down, it works exactly the same way. So that the light would fall through an oculus and out an opening on the north side. But the added benefit would be that the light would only come out at its appointed hour by that principle. It wouldn't leak otherwise. And we realized also that we could probably just keep this original configuration and allow the light to play inside, and when it landed on some kind of place, there would be some kind of corresponding moment between the outside and the inside marking. And so we also realized that this was possible to sort of graft both worlds of information on. That's the east and west wall. So you have this sort of new definition of openings. There's infalling openings and there's outfalling openings. So some of them function for light to fall out of, and some of them function for light to fall into. The bigger issue was construction. That was a question of making, because we certainly didn't want to make it out of a solid material with holes in it. We didn't think that that was appropriate. We had the hope that we could work to generate a structure from the sun's own, sort of say, motion, from its own record. And so we started working with just allowing the openings themselves to become generative and nothing else. So all the openings became that way. They just started to generate fins. We started to think about interlocking fins as perhaps a way of starting to generate a structure. We're only seeing it as a kind of a structural idea at this point, not an idea of cladding. But as we continued to explore this idea of the structure growing out of the sun's record by allowing each opening to sort of extend its edges, we realized that maybe we could get away with, if the structure was deep enough, we could start to make the sun box work to make it opaque to the sunlight, except for its appointed hours, and still to allow it to be transparent for the viewer on the ground. And so, after some versions, we realized we had to get very, very deep in order to mask the light. And we were able to actually avoid sort of making everything uniformly deep by allowing each fin to start to act independently. So some fins sort of grew inward, some fins grew outward, and we were still able to maintain the smallness of an opening. Because the idea of deepening all the fins would have meant that we would have to enlarge all the openings, which would have, again, defeated the whole project. So we were able to maintain quite small openings and make very deep fins to prevent the light from falling through. So it was kind of a skiographic opacity that we were looking for. And so this is a version where you start to see the fins moving independently, either inwards or outwards. I mean, always forming their logic around the opening of the light. And sort of one of the other consequences, which wasn't expected but most welcome, was that we had realized that there were overlapping areas. But with this moving the fins around, we found that a lot of these overlapping areas were, in a way, taken care of, so to speak, because by moving the fins back and forth, and this is a kind of a view showing, a general idea of how these three overlapping areas would become actually three independent openings from the sun's point of view. So there you see a final record drawing of it with with all sides. So all sides were built out of this fin structures, and all sides, as I showed before, had infalling or outfalling openings. And on the ground, on the outside, were plaques where the light would be allowed to fall through. So there you see the whole structure as it is as a record. There you see it in the park. We didn't know what the site would be, so because the form of the structure can be made independent of the sunlight, because they're simply it's a problem of intersection. We were interested in the form being given over to its surroundings. We had hoped to get an urban site, but we didn't, and we got the park site in a very late date, so we went along with the simple form we had been working with before, which was generated by the specific sun information for Providence. And this is before they're put into the ground. These are the markers for the different dates and hours that were baked ceramic that were then dug into the ground. And there you see the light just before it's about to pass through an opening. And you just see a sequence reading all the way across the top before and then through here. And it's about equal increments of time, just to see that at this, that the window starts to open up just before the plaque and opens up. Light brushes it, and then the window closes up again, and the light's gone. At the same time, you have the light that falls into the center of the piece, and the light that falls onto the plaque out in the field. So the whole piece is about 13 feet high, 6 feet by 10 feet. There you see the plaques buried in the ground. Became, for us, most interesting from the inside as a kind of an idea about being sort of, in architecture. Because it had the similar, it started to do things that we didn't expect. One is that it caught light, held it inside itself. There was always a glow inside. The other thing, it had a strange way of orienting yourself in the world because it became dense, very, very dense from certain angles and very transparent from other angles. There you can see the two, how dense it gets and how open. Another strange happening was that there's lots of weddings photographed at this strange thing. An important thing was it was a bit of a tough neighborhood, and there was this was part of a yearly art celebration where sculptors are invited to put up pieces. And a lot of work gets vandalized. And we were very paranoid as we were working on this because we were about 25 people working on this for quite a while. But actually it taught us a lesson. Because we were there so much every day working on this, the locals became curious and didn't feel threatened by it and became in a way attached to it and sort of watched out for it. And it never had a thing done to it. I think one piece was broken accidentally by someone playing with it. But it never had anything done to it in its 10 months of life. There you see the view up to the oculus. And the one exception, you could say, to the using the fins to block all light was in this area here, because we needed to make it like a bow tie so that the light could come in at the lowest angle possible. Because there was a certain tree coverage, so we knew that we didn't have to get the light in very shallowly, but we had to get it in at a certain angle. And we wanted to use the fins. It means that this has to be, in theory, like a knife edge. So we just worked with the fins as close as we could and then went to this one panel. And that's why the oculus, which is at the center, is not centered on the panel, because the panel was, again, defined by where the light needs to be blocked by the horizontal piece. Because as you can see, the fins are generated by the information coming up from the sides. So the fins are eccentric. Just to share with you just some photos of its making. And I would say that we were very amateurish about it. I mean, we just worked, as a kind of a team. And we spent a week with calculators in my office, 8 people with calculators for a week, just calculating. And then we just went through. The whole thing was constructed out of these slotted pieces of marine plywood. There was no glue, no nails, no hardware. It was just fitted together fins, just slotted together. And the structure, I guess it did succeed. It succeeded in part by redundancy. I mean, there's about 10,000 joints, so it just became stiffened. It also, I think, started to work because they were offset, the fins. So that also introduced a kind of stiffening aspect. But in a way, we worked blindly, in a way, kind of like trusting that it would work. The biggest problem, the most time was spent looking for pieces or trying to figure out what the mistakes were. What notch wasn't cut or was cut half an inch off. It was more a logistics problem, I think, than constructing. Because you can see there, you can see one piece. It might have 20 cuts in it, and each cut has to be in the exact right place and the exact right length. So the possibility of errors were enormous. And so if that piece wasn't going to fit, then you had to sort of track through and figure out why. That was really what consumed the time. And so it was built partially in our shop and taken out, and partially on site. The 2 walls had to be built on site as well as the roof because it was too large to get out any door. You can see that the wall itself was fairly robust. They were quite strong as free elements. I think this is maybe the last image. You can see there you see the roof just finished on the slide on the right, still in its fresh colors. And it's just a close-up of the roof under construction. Thanks. All right. Well, we can.
Fascinating
Yeah.
thing. I do want to take, if you do have to run off, go ahead and go now, because there's a few minutes for questions. Maybe if we can get some questions from the floor. But if you do need to go, please do go now as quietly as possible. And those who would like to ask questions of Chris Bardt, you can remain, and we'll start those in just a second.
Thanks.
I mean, this is it, because otherwise,
Yeah.
and then the hard chords.
There's a RISD guy, graduate here.
Which?
Sung Ho?
Oh, right. And I also certainly hope there's some questions from my guys. You guys, come on. You'll be dealing with this a lot in the coming term.
It's okay. You're much less like Harvard students here.
If there is one thing that I could
There's a
kick off
question
with.
here.
Sorry? Did you have a question?
Yeah, are there possibilities for making similar pieces of work which are inhabitable?
There's a question for those who couldn't hear it. Is there the possibility of making a similar piece which is inhabitable?
Yeah, I would hope so. I mean, one of my dreams was that someone would see it and say, "I'd love a house like this," and then I would work on it. But I can't say I've worked on it, literally to make it inhabitable, because I think the principles are transportable. They don't deny function or inhabitation, for that matter.
I had a question, Chris, in as much as each clock or calendar that we encounter, whether it be perhaps an atomic clock in an outer orbit aircraft that's therefore weightless, or if we encounter a calendar, a sundial, any given kind of clock or calendar which is using physical forces to measure time or to measure the seasons. I think that they each make a certain interpretation available of time and of the passing of time. Maybe you could reflect a bit on when you were present inside the calendar, the Sunworks, when you were present inside of it, or when you were observing it from outside, what was the real effect, emotional or otherwise, of time? Did it slow time? Did it cause certain interpretations of time that people experienced?
Well, ironic to say this, but it became less interesting as a clock. In fact, it probably who needs a clock? We have a watch. As a kind of timepiece, it was less important in terms of like measuring. But there was something else I could say, the qualitative aspects, which became were to us surprising. Like we would go out there at the appointed hour and say, okay, in 10 minutes this is going to happen, and something, and light would fall through one of these openings, and we would always be a little bit enchanted. And that was for us remarkable, that we could still be enchanted by something so simple as light falling through an opening. So in that sense, I think it was more like a process of recovery rather than something new being felt. It was very old. For us, it was more like an old thing than a new thing. And, well, in Providence, that's something that is rare.
Other questions from the floor? Anybody? There is another lecture coming up at 7, I believe. Preston Scott Cohen. So if you take a break, there will be a lecture in 25 minutes starting up. Thank you very much.